The year was 1543. The fields of England were restless with spring. Lambs bleated in meadows, peasants tilled the soil under a gray sky, and behind the tall walls of the royal palace, a wedding was being arranged, not for love, not even for alliance, but for continuity, political stability. And for appearances, you're standing in the shadows of the Tudor court, a place where the rustle of silk often covered the sound of betrayal, and where children were never just children, not if they were born royal. Her name was Mary, Queen of Scots, and she was barely 6 years old. He was Henry VIII, King of England, nearly 52, and though not the groom himself, he had every intention of marrying her off to his son, Prince Edward, age 5, almost immediately. But not. Before entertaining an older backup plan, marrying the 6-year-old girl to himself, this was not a bedtime fairy tale. It was a royal strategy. Mary was the only surviving legitimate child of James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise. Her father died just 6 days after her birth, leaving her an infant queen in Scotland, a kingdom ruled by regents. To the people of Scotland, she was a sign of hope. To England's king, she was a pawn. It was the age of dynastic marriages, a world where alliances were formed not with treaties, but with toddlers. When Mary turned 6, her education was underway. She was fluent in Latin and French before most children could properly write their own names. Her governess made sure she sat straight for hours. Her playtime was managed. Her clothes were embroidered with symbols of both France and Scotland. Because her fate was still undecided, would she marry into France or be forced into England? What she wanted was never part of the question. In 1543, England and Scotland signed the Treaty of Greenwich, an agreement meant to unite the two crowns by promising Mary to Prince Edward, the future Edward VI. On paper, it was brilliant. 2 crowns, united through marriage. No more wars, no more invasions, and more importantly, no more Catholic interference in a Protestant England. But Mary's mother, a devout Catholic and loyal to her French roots, stalled. By December that year, Mary was officially betrothed to Edward while being secretly prepped for a different alliance with France. You might think being a child queen would earn you a special kind of peace or grace. Instead, it meant being constantly surrounded by people who wanted to use you. By age 6, Mary had her own household, her own seal, her own royal responsibilities. She was already writing letters to kings and receiving gifts from foreign dignitaries. A normal child might worry about spilled ink or falling in mud. Mary worried about the color of her signature wax and the political implications of her doll's clothing. She was not allowed to run. She was not allowed to laugh too loudly. She was trained to speak like a queen even when her teeth had just started falling out. One record from her nurse's diary mentions Mary asking if she would sleep in England forever. The line, hauntingly ambiguous, was ignored at the time. But with hindsight, you wonder, did she already sense what was coming? Henry VIII, frustrated by Scotland's hesitation, decided to force the marriage through violence. What followed was a military campaign known euphemistically as the Rough Wooing. Imagine it, England sending soldiers to burn Scottish towns, to invade, but to pressure the Scottish nobility into agreeing to a marriage. Between 2 toddlers, Mary was moved from castle to castle for her safety. Her entourage grew smaller, the threat larger. In some locations, she was dressed in servant's clothing to avoid detection. All the while, she was still expected to study theology, write courtly letters, and embroider her future husbands. Initials. She was 6. And yet, in the letters of the time, her name appears beside war reports, royal decrees, and political strategy sessions. She was no longer a girl. She was a tool. Mary of Guise, Mary's mother, made her move. She secretly arranged for her daughter to marry the Dauphin of France, effectively abandoning the treaty with England. In July 1548, at the age of 5, Mary was sent across the sea to France. A Queen of Scotland, betrothed first to the Prince of England, now engaged to the future King of France. Her life, already a spectacle of political motion, had no room for stillness. And the question that hovers still: what does it mean to carry a crown before your 7th birthday? Section 2. The French education of a child queen. It is one thing to be born a queen. It is quite another to be raised as one in exile. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived in France in the summer of 1548. She was 5 years old and had never known a life that wasn't shaped by someone else's agenda. Her arrival was less like the triumphant entry of a future royal bride, and more like the discreet deposit of a valuable political investment. She disembarked not to cheers or processions, but to the careful inspection of the French court, where King Henry II of France had agreed to her engagement to his son, Francois, the Dauphin. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, remained behind in Scotland to protect the interests of the House of Guise and Catholic influence there. Her daughter, meanwhile, would be shaped by the gold-leafed chambers of Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Trained in a culture that was not her own, the French court was dazzling. Perfumed halls, towering wigs, and a language of gestures, titles, and propriety. Mary was a foreign queen, yes, but she was still a child. She cried sometimes at night, often for her nurse, sometimes for Scotland, occasionally for nothing at all. But she adapted quickly. She had to. Mary was raised in the company of French princesses and noblewomen, including the infamous Catherine de' Medici, her future mother-in-law, whose influence over France would one day rival that of any king. Catherine watched Mary closely, not with kindness, but with calculation. This girl would marry her son. She would one day sit beside him on a throne. And Catherine, for all her experience, did not plan to be sidelined. Mary was taught not just French and Latin, but Italian, Greek, and music. She read Virgil and Seneca before her 10th birthday. She wrote poetry. She practiced her calligraphy until her fingers ached. She also learned how to walk properly, not just step after step, but with the regal glide that made skirts float and heads turn, one foot slightly in front of the other, chin tilted, hands relaxed, back straight, even when cold or ill or homesick, because even in childhood, appearances were everything. Mary did not come to France alone. She was accompanied by 4 other girls, all named Mary: Mary Seton, Mary Fleming, and Mary Livingston, daughters of noble Scottish families, chosen to be her lifelong companions. Together, they were known as the 4 Marys. They weren't playmates in the usual sense. They were selected to reflect her nobility, to reinforce her identity as a Scottish queen, and more practically, to spy on each other. Letters written decades later hint that even as children, each, Mary knew she was being watched by the others. Secrets were whispered, then repeated. Loyalties formed and broke and reformed again, as all young girls do. But these young girls had kingdoms attached to their names. Still, there were moments of childhood between the cracks. They would sneak bread from the kitchens, try on old gowns from storage rooms, and sit by the Seine, whispering about whether princes really loved their wives. In one letter, Mary asks her tutor, "Do all marriages begin in treaties?" The tutor did not answer. Francois, Mary's intended husband, was a sickly child with a weak voice and a fragile constitution. He suffered from chronic ear infections, and some suspected he would not survive to adulthood. His appearance was slight, his posture poor, but Mary was taught to love him. More accurately, she was taught to be loyal to him. When Francois was 12 and Mary 11, their engagement was formalized again. French tailors began sewing her wedding trousseau. Royal architects began sketching. a new set of royal apartments. Painters captured her growing beauty in oil-slim, red-haired, pale-skinned, and unusually tall for a girl of her age. By 13, she had already become something of a legend in French courts. A queen of Scotland. A future queen of France. And yet she had no country she truly belonged to. Scotland was distant, ruled by regents and advisors, mostly men who wrote in her name, but acted for their own interests. France was where she lived, but never entirely. As one of them, she was always slightly other. The foreign queen. The Scottish girl with a French heart and an English problem, because across the Channel, another woman had taken the throne. Elizabeth I of England, a Protestant, queen, unmarried, unapologetic, illegitimate in the eyes of many Catholics. And here was Mary, Catholic, royal, and most importantly, a blood descendant of Henry VII, making her, by some reckonings, the rightful Queen of England. This is where things begin to shift. Mary had been raised with the idea that she was the Queen of Scots, soon to be Queen of France. Now she was being told she might be Queen of England too, and in a moment that history often overlooks, the French court began to groom her for more than one crown. French priests taught her English law. She was instructed in Anglican theology, not to believe in it, but to understand how to discredit it. Her letters began to adopt a more cautious tone. Her portraits started to include English roses. Mary wasn't just being trained for a political marriage. She was being trained for a potential conquest. Still, childhood found its way in. There are stories half rumor, half truth of Mary hiding behind drapes to eavesdrop on royal conversations, of sneaking into the kitchens to make honey cakes, of laughing too loud and being scolded for it by Catherine de' Medici, of tears when letters from Scotland arrived late. There's a record from a chambermaid noting that Mary once asked, "If I marry a sick king, do I become a sick queen?" An innocent question. But in a court like France, every question was a strategy. Mary was nearly 15 now. She had spent almost 2/3 of her life preparing for roles she didn't choose. And across the Channel, Elizabeth I had begun to send envoys, letters, veiled threats. The message was clear. If Mary so much as claimed the English throne, it would mean war. And so the stage was set. A queen in exile with 3 claims to 3 thrones. A young, sickly prince to marry. A court that praised her beauty was sharpened, their knives in secret, and the question that remained was no longer if Mary would become queen, but which crown would she wear first. Section 3, 3 crowns, 1 coffinet, was April 24th, 1558. The bells of Notre Dame Cathedral rang out across Paris. The crowd swelled, murmuring in French and Scots and Latin. Petals were thrown from the balconies. Incense burned so heavily, it clung to skin. Inside the great cathedral, standing beside the ill and delicate Francois, Mary Stuart was formally married. She was 15. The world, it seemed, was finally ready to crown her. She was already Queen of Scotland by birth. Now, she was the Dauphine of France, wife to the heir of the French throne. And to many Catholics across Europe, she was also the rightful Queen of England, a challenge to Elizabeth I, who ruled without a husband and without the Church's blessing. Mary's claim came not by ambition, but by blood. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. If you erased the divorce of Henry VIII, as the Pope had done, Elizabeth became illegitimate and Mary, the true heir. This wedding was not just a celebration. It was a statement. One court chronicler wrote that Mary's train was longer than any ever seen in France, for it carried not just her gown, but the weight of 3 kingdoms. Just over a year later, in July 1559, King Henry II of France died in a jousting accident, splintered wood in the eye, infection, death. He lingered only days. And with his passing, Mary's husband Francois became King Francois II. Mary was now Queen of France, Queen of Scotland, and depending on your religious beliefs and political loyalties, Queen of England. She was 16 years old, but power is rarely what it seems. Her husband, still frail and frequently ill, barely ruled. Real power sat with the Guise family, Mary's uncles, who used the royal couple as symbols, while Catherine de' Medici plotted from the inn. Sidelines, clawing back control. Meanwhile, Protestantism surged in France, and civil unrest simmered beneath the surface. And Mary, increasingly watched, praised, and feared, began to understand something deeply unnerving. Being queen didn't make you free. It made you a target. Her letters began to change. Fewer flourishes. More direct instructions to her mother. In Scotland, coded language. Paranoia, perhaps, but not unfounded. And then, less than 18 months after becoming king, Francois died. He was 16, a sick child, a frail husband, a dead king, and Mary, again, became a widow. She was 17, childless, a widow, in a court that no longer needed her. And so, after more than a decade in France, Mary made the painful decision to return to Scotland, a land she hadn't seen since she was a toddler. She barely spoke the language anymore. Her education had been French. Her manners were foreign. Her clothing exotic. Her accent soft and Parisian. When she landed in Leith in 1561, the weather was gray and wet, and no procession greeted her. The docks were half empty. She stepped off the ship, wearing black mourning not just her husband, but the world she lost. Back in Scotland, Mary was queen, but only in name. The Protestant Reformation had changed the landscape. Her people no longer trusted French influence. They no longer followed the Pope. Her half-brother James Stuart governed as regent, and while he welcomed her politely, he kept his power firmly in his grip. She tried to win over her people with charm. She hosted banquets, rode out to meet farmers, attended Protestant sermons, despite being a devout Catholic. But it was always uneasy. Mary needed to secure her position. And that meant marriage again. In 1565, she married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a charming but shallow man with royal blood. He was handsome, charismatic, and ambitious. Their early marriage was marked by hope. But within months, things unraveled. He drank heavily. He demanded the crown matrimonial equal authority to Mary. When she refused, he turned violent. In a scandal that shocked all Europe, Darnley led a group of nobles into Mary's private chambers, where her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, was dragged out and stabbed over 50 times in front of the pregnant queen. Mary was terrified. And yet she stayed. Darnley's murder came just months later. In February 1567, an explosion rocked the house where he was recovering from illness. His body was found in the garden strangled, not burned. Suspicion fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Awe. Bothwell, a powerful noble and one of Mary's closest allies. The evidence was murky. Rumors flew. And then, in a move that historians still argue over, Mary married Bothwell only weeks after Darnley's death. Some say she was kidnapped and coerced. Others say she was in love. Still others believe she was politically cornered and saw no other path. The result was chaos. The Scottish lords rebelled. Her own nobles turned against her. Protestants spread rumors of witchcraft. Catholics distanced themselves in fear. She was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, then forced to abdicate the throne in favor of her infant son, James VI. She was 24. Queen 3 times over, now a prisoner of her own people, Mary escaped captivity and fled to England, hoping Elizabeth would offer her shelter and support. After all, they were cousins. Both queens, both women ruling in a man's world. But Elizabeth saw something else. A threat. Mary had once claimed her throne, had been backed by France and the Pope, and still had Catholic supporters across Europe. The English court was full of whispers. If Mary remained alive, she could inspire rebellion. So Elizabeth did what queens do. She kept Mary under house arrest for 19 years. Mary passed the time sewing, writing, playing music. She plotted, wrote coded letters, and was eventually caught involved in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Whether she knew of it or not, her name was on the documents. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. She wore a crimson gown, the color of martyrdom. She whispered prayers in Latin as the axe fell. It took 2 blows to sever her head. She was 44 years old. So here lies the story. Girl crowned before she could walk. A queen 3 times over of Scotland, of France, and in claim of England. Married at 6. Widowed at 17. Executed. Before 50. She left behind no direct power, no surviving dynasty, no kingdom of her own. And yet her son, James VI of Scotland, would go on to become James I of England, uniting the crowns his mother once symbolically held. Her body was eventually buried in Westminster Abbey, not far from Elizabeth I. 2 queens, once rivals in life, now lie side by side in death. And the question still lingers. Was she ever truly a queen, or only ever a symbol? Passed between kings and causes, never free, never in control, a crown always resting just out of reach.